I talked a little bit earlier about when you call your friends to be able to put something on. And I have the distinct honor of introducing a great friend of mine, David Hartman. Now, all of you that are my age or beyond know this voice in a heartbeat, because one of the first greatest morning shows was Good Morning America, and you saw David out there, and you know that he's the greatest interviewer in the world. But many of you don't know he's a former Air Force officer, but also just a great champion for aviation. And whenever we have a great event and we want to be able to talk to people that can inspire us, we have David pull the stories out. And David, I heard that you were just on the phone with one great hero that we have not been able to have with us tonight.
Well, we were all disappointed. Good evening, everybody. We were disappointed. As most of you know, Bob Hoover was supposed to be with us tonight. He fell a couple of weeks ago, cracked a rib, can't travel. He's on the mend. He's going to be fine. He'll be at Oshkosh, he told me. But Pete, he also said, he also said to Pete to thank you on behalf of all of the World War II aviators for putting on this incredible event with all of your colleagues. It was impossible, but you've done the impossible, and Bob sends his regards with deep gratitude to you, Pete, and your colleagues. 70 years ago today, in a red schoolhouse in Reims, France, the Germans surrendered unconditionally, ending World War II in Europe. Well, tomorrow, out on the Mall, as you know, we will celebrate the 70th anniversary of VE Day, which is the 8th of May. Well, tonight, here in this shrine to aviation and all of our exploration of space, we're going to look back for a few minutes at World War II. Very briefly, in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. By 1938, the Japanese controlled most of China. During those very same years, Hitler was building his war machine, and in 1939 invaded Poland. By 1941, Germany controlled Denmark and Norway, Belgium and Luxembourg, the Netherlands and France, Yugoslavia and Greece, and then invaded Russia. And they also started to bomb the dickens out of England. What became known as the Blitz, the incredible Brits fought off the Germans in the Battle of Britain. Well, for many in our country, the mood had been to try to stay neutral in this war. Of course, that wasn't to be. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor December 7, 1941. We declared war on Japan the next day, on Germany and Italy 3 days later. And over the next 4 years, our country was transformed. It literally metamorphosed militarily, economically, and certainly in the most human terms describable. And like millions of others, of very young people, these four gentlemen, our panelists, were very young warriors. They were leaders. They were heroes of World War II. Please welcome our four panelists. Yeah. Since their more extended bios are in the programs, I'm going to introduce them very briefly, starting next to me. Karnig Thomasian, he enlisted at the age of 18, didn't even finish high school. He was a gunner on the B-29. His third combat mission, the plane exploded. He was one of some of his crew who were able to bail out. He spent 4 months as a prisoner of the Japanese. 6 months, excuse me. Was one of only a few survivors of that POW camp. He was liberated and came home and discharged as a staff sergeant. Karnig Thomasian. Next to him, Chester Finagin, naval aviator, commander, U.S. Navy, retired. Flew Corsairs and Wildcats in the Pacific, downed a Japanese fighter in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, survived a kamikaze attack on the escort carrier, the USS Manila, and they were back in operations on the deck of that carrier the next day. Chester Finagin. Next to him, Charles McGee, Air Force Colonel, retired, Tuskegee Airman, pinned on his wings on June of 1943, flew 137 Mustang missions out of Italy, shot down a Focke-Wulf 190, also flew the Mustang in Korea and F-4s in Vietnam. Distinguished Air Force career, commanding at many levels, very highly decorated. He is an inductee of the National Aviation Hall of Fame. And besides that, he is also a record holder. In the history of the entire United States Air Force, Charles McGee holds the record for flying the most fighter missions flown in 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, 409 fighter missions. Charlie McGee. Bud Anderson, Air Force Colonel, retired, triple ace, flying the P-51 Mustang out of Leiston, England with the 357th Fighter Group. Did all of his 2 tours of combat flying, all of it, at the age of 22 when he was a major. Had 117 missions. After the war, he spent most of the rest of his career as a test pilot at Edwards, but he flew the F-86 in Korea and THUDs in Vietnam. He commanded his last post as commander of the Tactical Fighter Wing in Vietnam. He is also highly decorated and an inductee of the National Aviation Hall of Fame. He is also a record holder. Of the living aces today in the United States, he is the highest scoring ace with his 16 1/4 air victories over Germany.
Wow. Fantastic.
You think about it, since December 7, 1941, our country has been at war, either hot or cold or both at the same time, every day since December 7, 1941. However, on Pearl Harbor Day, we had not been at war for over 20 years. These gentlemen were all in their late teens or very early 20s. So guys, talk to us. What was it like before Pearl Harbor hit? What were your lives doing before that? What was going on in the mood of the country? And then what happened after December 7th? Karnig, you were the young guy.
We were watching what's going on in Europe, and but we were living a life, peaceful, very happy, going to school in my case, and basically having no real issues or problems.
And you enlisted?
And I enlisted later when there was a time when I was going to be drafted. So I said, well, I want to go in the Air Force.
Right.
And so I chose to enlist. I left school, chose to enlist. Before that, I was doing riveting in Brewster aircraft.
Right.
And the union man came to me when I didn't go out on the break. They said, hey, you got to go out on the break, have a smoke. Well, I don't smoke, I said. I don't never smoked in my life. He says, you smoke or you won't get, I won't speak up for you and you won't be a member of the union. I said, are you nuts? Our world is, our country is at war and you're worrying about your, I was fed up. That week I left and I joined the Air Force. That's it.
By the way, you were 18. What did your parents think about this? And to what extent did they say, oh, yeah, that's a good idea?
Well, I spoke to them, and I remember it very well today. I said, look, here's how I feel. I don't know what's going to happen, I'm going to do the best I can, but I have to do this. It's in my heart to do it. I think it's the right thing to do, and I'm going to do it. Have I got your blessing? And they did.
Wow. Chester, you raised here in the D.C. area. What was it like before December 7 and what happened after December 7?
Well, it was a quiet town before December 7th. And since then, it had changed considerably. But at that time, when Pearl Harbor occurred, I was in high school. And all my early childhood days had been spent just about a mile away from Bowling Field and Naval Air Station here in Washington. And we used to ride our bicycles down to the Naval Air Station and play around the planes. We would stand behind them when the mechanics were running them up in the morning and lean back on the prop wash. And just imagine trying to do that today. But I always wanted to be a Navy pilot, so I set my course. All the high school courses that I had were to help me get to the exam for the Naval Academy. Having no political background, no political help, I could not get an appointment. So I went to work for the local telephone company. Shortly after I went to work for them, the Navy changed their policy. And in order to get into the Naval Aviation Cadet Program, you just had to pass a sort of preliminary exam. You didn't need the 2 years of college, which they had been requiring before. So on the day I was 18, I went down to the recruiting office and took the exam, had no problem with that. Went in to take the medical, and I was 5 pounds underweight. So the doctor says, come back when you grow up. But he told me to come back and try it after about 3 weeks of eating all I could eat. So I came back, passed the exam. I was still a pound short, but he said, when you start eating the Navy food, you'll grow.
Yeah.
So with that, I guess things began Navy style, and I'm just so glad that the Navy changed that program when they did.
Absolutely. Bud, Northern California, what were you doing, and how interested were you with aviation to begin with, or not, and what was going on pre-Pearl Harbor?
Well, I was just a kid that grew up on the farm, and I had this dream of flying airplanes. It didn't have anything to do with the war. And of course, we were in a depression, and there was no way in the world that I could afford to learn how to fly. So this would be, I got out of high school in 1939, and I looked up the requirements for the Navy or the Army Air Corps. We didn't have a U.S. Air Force in those days. And I found out you had to be 20 years old, you have to have 2 years of college, physically fit and unmarried. So I went to a junior college in Sacramento to get my 2 years of college. And while I was there, something really great happened. The government had a subsidized program where for the price of, I think it was $9.50 for an insurance policy for my parents and their written permission, I got a private pilot's license while I was going to my second year of college. And there was no commitment for service. The government could see that the war was coming, and they were trying to get young men interested in aviation. I was still 19, and the peacetime requirements, you had to be 20. So I got a job as the course I took was an aeronautical course, and it qualified me to be an aircraft mechanic. And I went to work to the local air depot. Sacramento Air Depot was building up at the time. And then Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th, and I was still 19. The next month, January 42, on my birthday, I went right to the recruiting office, rushed to the recruiting office, I might say, and 2 days later, I was gone.
Charles, you were smiling listening to him talk about his love of aviation when he was telling that story. Was that true for you? Did you have a bug for flying airplanes early?
I don't know whether to say unfortunate or not, but no, that wasn't me. At that time, when Pearl Harbor hit, of course, I was doing a little work to get enough money to get my second year of college in. You know, the country had come out of 10 years of depression, and fortunately the family said, get your high school degree, go to college. I was doing that, and I heard about a program that in Mile Fly, but it was because of segregation that I learned of the program because the Army Air Corps at that time said they couldn't use a black pilot because they had no black mechanics. And so when the Army was forced to experiment, well, they said it would be an experiment because they expected it was not going to be successful. They started mechanics training at Chinook Field, Rantoul, Illinois. I was at the University of Illinois 14 miles away and heard about this program. And although I had never had an inch in flying, I think maybe my ROTC instructor said, well, you ought to be a pilot. That struck me well because to avoid the draft, I went and took the exams and passed them and got called in as a cadet and got my flight.
I might add that December 7th was his 22nd birthday.
Yeah.
And also he graduated 9th out of 436 in his high school. So the signs were all there for Charles McGee.
Well, you know, so what it amounts to, I avoided the draft because I had learned how to handle a rifle in ROTC, and I think we called it ground pounding, I think, back then. I figured that going around the mud and carrying a rifle might not be so good. But after my first flight in the cadet program, I knew I'd made the right decision.
Charles, thinking back and learning about you, not only you, but thousands of your black comrades decided you not only wanted to fight for your country against the enemy, but with Jim Crow laws, racism, injustice going on, and the top of the military of the United States saying, as you said, this is an experiment, and they're black and they can't do it. Where did it come from in your head and heart and wherever else to want to take on the business of racism as well as wanting to become a pilot?
Well, you know, I think that comes from many years where parents and grandparents realized that you needed to get an education, number one. You needed to treat other people like you wanted to be treated, number two, and that there was an opportunity. And I think what, even though the Army didn't change their policy, our action dispelled the premises that they had saying we couldn't do something, and it allowed our Air Force later to say that, you know, talent doesn't come in color or happenstance of birth. It comes in being prepared, and that's the opportunities that we have had here in America.
Wow. Because of our time constraint, I want to cut right to some of their combat experiences, all of which are super compelling, goes without saying. Karnig, B-29, you're a gunner.
Mm-hmm.
You're one of the first B-29s to go into combat. You fly to India. A mission is set up. What was the mission? How many airplanes? What were your targets?
All right, the first mission was to Bangkok. actually to Thailand, I'm sorry. And it was merely to bomb a bridge. And so the first mission was just a milk run. We just went there, bombed the bridge, came back.
Second mission?
The second mission was to Mukden, Manchuria, which meant we had to go over the hump, the Himalayas,
From Burma.
with our bomb load, land in China at a forward base, gas up, and then go on to our target. And the second mission was successful in getting to the target. On the way back, we got hit in our engine, and one of our engines went. So our pilot, being very democratic, put it to it this way. Look, we can't keep up with the rest of the formation. We may or may not make it back. So the alternative is we could go to Russia and intern there. Well, 100% negative. None of that. I won't go into what the Russians did, but anyway, we got back. And a week later, on December 13th, we got another mission to go to Thailand again, and to bomb a bridge. And so
Secondary target?
Its secondary target was Rangoon, Burma, a railway yards. So the bridge was covered with clouds and everything. We couldn't bomb it, so we went to secondary target.
All right, before you go on,
Yeah.
who was Colonel Blanchard?
Colonel Blanchard was the chief of our squadron, our whole base. And the bombardiers, the head bombardier, had gone to him and said, Colonel, we have a bad load of bombs.
In other words,
Because the colonel
loaded.
Right. The colonel demanded that they add 500 pounders to the 1,000 pounders. Didn't need the 500 pounders, not for the bridge. The 1,000 pounders were the only thing that would destroy the bridge. And with no fuses. No fuses meaning once they left the ship, if they hit each other, that's it.
So your bombardier
He
advised,
knew.
warned the
Yeah,
colonel.
and Blanchard said, you either go on the mission or you're court-martialed. And so we went on the mission. Now, none of the regular crews knew about this, only the bombardiers. I learned this later on.
So how many airplanes?
There were 11 airplanes went over the target. Only one ship, after the explosion, which absolutely flipped our plane over, went down directly over the target. One ship destroyed completely in the air. And so that makes 4 ships in all went right over the target. The rest never made it to the home base in Chikulia. Only one ship got back. Now, the reason for all this was that the trajectories of the 1,000 pounders and the 500s are different. And I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to figure this out, that this is dangerous. But LeMay had a contest for most tonnage over the target, and our West Pointer was not to deny his general. And so he put as much tonnage over the target. Now, the cost was 11 ships, because the other one wasn't in any good shape. 18 men killed, 29 men imprisoned. Now, years later, when I decided to write a book, I wrote to West Point and asked very gingerly, hey, I'm writing a book about this famous general, because they made him a general, naturally. And I'd like to write correctly. You know, I want the right information. I don't want to make up stories. Oh, he said, well, sure, we'll send you his dossier. They sent it to me. Not one dot, not one letter, number, nothing of the December 14th raid. I don't know how you do this, but it was done.
Let's hold it there. We'll
Yeah.
get to your prisoner experience in a minute. But it brings up a question. That was your Southeast Asia mission.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Chet, you started, what, Corsairs, New Hebrides Island, South Pacific?
Yes.
Right? Flying a ground squadron, no tail hooks. But you had a problem one day. What happened?
Well, we were doing a lot of training because we were waiting for the Navy to decide whether the battle from the Army Air Corps and the Marine Corps about the Navy having land-based squadrons. So they wanted to decommission us, and after about 4 months, we were decommissioned. But at that time, we were doing a lot of gunnery practice, and coming back from the gunnery practice one day, we ran the Corsairs pretty hard, and my engine had a broken fuel pump shaft. Well, if you don't pump fuel into that R2800 engine, it stops. So just in sight of the airport, at the Palakula Airport, the engine stopped, and being a nice 21-year-old aviator, I thought, well, I can make this, no problem. So I called in and told them I had the dead engine, but I was going to make the landing to clear the field. So they did. They cleared the field, and I came around, and I was so happy I even lowered the landing gear. And that slowed me down even more. It ended up that I hit the ground, broke off both the landing gear, and flipped over upside down and slid down the runway. So I did make the runway. But the Marston matting on the runway let us slide good, and the plane was not usable after that. But I was not hurt at all. I got up out of the plane, and they kept me in the sick bay overnight just for sure, and went on back to flying the following day. But that's what happens when you're young and you think you can do a lot more than you can.
Charles? Now, so Charles, you're flying Mustangs out of Remitilia, Italy?
Yes.
And what were your missions? Describe the missions that you were flying in Mustangs.
Well, we had some good ones. Some were escorting B-17s and B-24s. You may have penetration escort, or you may carry them all the way, or varies a bit. And when the weather was keeping the bombers on the ground, we had some fighter sweeps. We probably destroyed more aircraft, German aircraft on the ground than we did in the air. Particularly the raids on the Pulaski oil fields pretty much grounded a lot of the German Air Force once we destroyed the fuel supplies and so on. So it was kind of a double duty, which we enjoyed.
How did it come about that painting your tails and spinners red?
Well, if you want the war story, somebody had a red rudder, but said the pilot came out and said, "That's not enough, paint the whole tail." That's a war story, that's not right. There were 4 squadrons that began the escort of our B-17s and B-24s, and there may have been a directive from 15th Air Force, but one squadron ended up with yellow tail, another had candy stripe, another had checkerboard square. Turned out 332nd Fire Group red tails. So red tails stuck with us. Now, which one of those and where the real story is, it's hard to figure out, as most of you know. It get turned around quite a bit, but I think it helped the gunners on the B-17s and B-24s know that we weren't a German aircraft approaching them, and it also let we pilots know we didn't want one of our own aircraft in our gun sight either, so it helped.
To what extent did the white bomber crews know that the red tails were all black pilots?
Most of them didn't know. Many of them, very few knew it until long after the war, that black pilots were flying the thing. You know, some of the war stories say, oh yeah, I knew that was a black pilot, he flew by, but you know, you got goggles on, the helmet and all this. Well, another war story about what you can see. But they knew that the red tails were giving them close support, and that's what they needed at the time, and it did save a lot of lives. And we had great leadership in Ben Davis, Jr. In fact, for those of you who know what it means, thank you. He told us young Rice second first lieutenants at the time that he would court-martial the pilot who goes happy hunting, and we believed him, so we stuck with the bombers.
Was he the first black four-star general?
No. Chappie James Jr., who, well, he was in the 12th Squadron in Korea, and I was with the 67th, coming out of the Philippines. But Chappie was one of these all-around people that he could talk to the folks down at the wharf, or he could go to the boardroom, he could play every instrument in the band, he could play football. There wasn't much Chappie couldn't do. And certainly at the time, even some of you may remember that he'd tell you when you're writing reports on officers, emphasize that they're good at public speaking. He was excellent. So he got some good ratings and good assignments, but served our country well.
Bud, now there you were flying out of Leiston, England. How similar were your missions to what Charles was flying out of Italy?
Well, our mission was, we were the first P-51B, the one with the Rolls-Royce engine in it, unit in the 8th Air Force. And of course, the 8th Air Force was tasked with the strategic bombing of Germany. And when we first got there, this concept of air power was not doing too good. The bombers were taking tremendous losses. It was supposedly mathematically impossible to complete a 25 mission tour in bombers in 1942 and 3. And they finally decided, hey, we got to have fighters. Well, we had fighters over there. We had P-47s and P-38s and Spitfires, but they couldn't go where the bombers wanted to go. They couldn't go everywhere. And I'd like to say it was by brilliant planning the Mustang arrived at exactly the right time. But it was not by brilliant planning, it was almost by accident. And there was another change that I think was significant. It's still air power, but the 8th Air Force changed command, and General Jimmy Doolittle took over the 8th Air Force. And he had a little bit different philosophy about warfare and things like this. And whereas when we first got to England, we were restricted in in the tactics that we could use. They wanted us to stay with the bombers, fly around them. It was kind of a feel-good thing, I think, in a way. And when the enemy came in, we were supposed to drive them away and come back. And you could follow them to 18,000 feet. If you had shot them down, you can back up and escort them. Well, when he got over there, he said, look, the mission of the 8th Air Force is to destroy the Luftwaffe. And we haven't been doing a very good job in the classic way of blowing up the factories and the airfields and the things on the ground. And I don't know whether he had different kind of information or what, but he changed our tactics, and I think it's a significant factor. What he told us, and matter of fact, we were ordered, it was a pursue and destroy. And he says, you fighter pilots now, when you engage the enemy, you take them to the ground and kill them. And I think the spring of 1944, our historians generally agree that we finally broke the back of the Luftwaffe, which allowed the invasion of Europe. You had to do that first. And how did we do it? We did it by killing their experienced pilots. They lost so many experienced pilots that they really couldn't put up a resistance, and that made the bombing easier, and they could go wherever they wanted to go now with the Mustang, and bomb with acceptable losses. I always wondered what acceptable losses were. I guess it's not you, it's acceptable.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Karnig.
Yes.
All right. So you're taken prisoner by the Japanese.
Right.
How were you treated?
Well, Japanese were Japanese. It was
What's that mean?
it was a different philosophy of life with the Japanese at that period of time. I've since had a different impression about it, but at that time, they were, the ones that were guarding us were of a different caliber. They must have been chosen to be cruel. I don't know what it is. And not to say that we didn't have similar types of things in our history. And, but it was a matter of trying daily to keep your head on your shoulders and think and keep out of their way. Don't involve them in anything. Listen to what they say, and if you got to stand at attention when they come by you, stand at attention, be ready. I remember once I was dozing in my solitary cell. It wasn't solitary because we were so crowded. When 29 men were captured, they had to put 2, 3, and 4 in the cell. And I was sleeping, and Brooksy, my radio operator, said, Tommy, get up. The guy's guard's coming. Well, I got up in the stupor and just stood there, and he just came in and by. Now, what happens if you don't? What happens if you don't? Happened to me. He brought me out of the cell at another time. He put the gun to my forehead, and he clicked it, and it was empty. And he laughed with his gold tooth sticking out and shoved me back in the cell. Well, boy, I almost passed out. They had this fun, and on Friday nights, when they drink, they would come and beat up the guys for nothing. For nothing. Interrogation sessions, they would hit us with teakwood clubs. My thinking is they could have killed us with those teakwood clubs if they wished. But they didn't. They just wanted us to suffer. They hit us enough to make us suffer. I mean, one shot in the head with a teakwood club and you're gone. So you had to just pick your time, and in the interrogations, make up stories because they believed anything you tell them. They asked me once to draw pictures of our base. So my co-pilot said, look, make up stories. So I said, okay. So this time when I went in, I drew a picture. I had a hangar here, not a hangar, but a pit stop there, and a plane over here, a PX over here. they started to get mad. And in this interrogation, there was an Indian National Army officer there. They collaborated with the Japanese. He says, "I know if you lie." I said, "Well, what are you asking me for?" Boom. They gave me a shot. But that's how they were. They weren't very intelligent, the ones that were in the captors.
Is there any way that any of us who have not been a POW, whether Japanese, Germany, Korea, Vietnam,
right,
is there any way that if we have not been a POW, like you were, that we can really understand what your experience was?
No, I don't think so. I had the experience. I used to drive to work with a carpool, friends of mine. And once they'd ask me, "Hey, you were POW, tell us about it." And so I wondered whether I should, or I said, so I'm driving and I'm talking, and the two guys in the back, they started talking about something else, and then I just cooled it, and I said to myself, don't be mad at them. They haven't got the background or the experience. They were 10, 15 years younger than I was. So how could they possibly know? So we're still very good friends because I don't hold it against them. They just didn't have that experience. How could they possibly know?
Chester, a different experience. You're on the Manila, and there's a kamikaze attack coming at your carrier. What happened? What'd you see?
Well, I was standing on the side of the ship and watching the plane come in with another pilot of the squadron. We were kidding back and forth. Well, they're going to hit him pretty soon. Everything on all the ships in the group were firing at this one plane. And I was slapping this other pilot on the back saying, they're going to get him, they're going to get him. And pretty soon he was close enough that they weren't going to get him. So Parmalee was the pilot's name, and I ducked into the passageway which went directly under the flight deck because we thought he was going to hit the side of the ship where we were. We got in the passageway, and all of a sudden the plane hit, and all the lights went out. Everything seemed to tumble, and I tried to get up, and I thought the whole flight deck had come down on that passageway. When I got a little bit more attention to myself, I found out that it was a line of lockers that were along the wall that just fell over. So we got through that fine, went up and noticed the hole in the flight deck was about, I guess, 20, 25 feet wide, right in the center of the flight deck, right by the island. And it had gone, the plane had gone down into the hangar deck, cut through all the communication cables. So the skipper up in the bridge had no way to talk to the people in the aft stations. So they had to send messengers back and forth because all the communication cables were broken. But the next morning, or during that night, the ships that were in the group would bring over materials, timbers, sheets of metal, girders, whatever they had. And the next morning, we took off from that deck. And we had an 18-inch hump in the deck itself where they had repaired that hole. But we went back and stayed there until the beach was secure. Then we were relieved to come back to Pearl Harbor to be repaired. But it was too much damage for Pearl Harbor, so we had to come all the way back to San Diego.
Charles, your incredible career in the Air Force, what is your experience growing up and in the Air Force told you about our country, about what our country is?
Well, that's how much time do we have? Interesting, it told that we can support the country regardless of our color or accident of birth. It's more about being prepared. It's about having an education, being willing to serve this country and enjoy the freedoms that we so much enjoy that creeping away in many little ways. But it's something that we need to let our young folks know. I think even that's what this flyby is going to do. Remember, don't forget, but we don't need to repeat it. And this is the type of thing that I think out of lessons, our experience allowed the move away from the attitudes that existed earlier, saying something we couldn't do or denying an opportunity. But it lifted up the challenge of being prepared and this is a challenge to our young people today. There's so much going on, but it's the things they need to know to be a part of our country's future and that we continue to enjoy the freedoms that we have. And as I say, it's not where you were born or how and that type of thing, but it's how you experience the education, preparing yourself to take a place in our country, a rightful place, and how you react from that position on, because it's so important.
Bud? You know, after all your experiences, goodness knows, how do you describe our America? What is this thing that we have?
Well, what I liked about World War II was how we pulled the country together. Once Japan attacked us, it was a different ball game. I mean, it absolutely, I think you had to be there to really understand it. The country became very, very patriotic. We nationalized our industry. You know, it was total war. And that was the other thing. It was, for the enemy, it was unconditional surrender. We didn't screw around with gradualism and all these other kind of things with fighting with one hand behind your back and all that, like we did in Korea and Vietnam. And it was a tremendous thing for the country. It's where the women got into the workforce, by the way, and they haven't looked back since. And I don't know. We seem to get away from being positive. That's my take on it.
Yeah. Karnig, you were liberated, got better, hospitals, got in C-47, found your way back on your way into LaGuardia, and you wrote that the pilot came across the harbor, and where did he bank the airplane?
Yeah, we were approaching Idlewild, and he said to us there were civilians on the plane as well.
Idlewild's the old JFK, by the way.
Right.
It's
a long time ago. Anyway, so he said, look out the side window of the plane. And so we all looked out, and he dropped down to about 500 feet, and he banked around the Statue of Liberty. I can't express what that did, what that meant. I was home. That was my home. It was just, oh, it's, you know, there are moments like this you can't really, you never forget, number one. And the other moment that I'll never forget is I went up to my apartment where I lived, and a Spalding ball came down, and I picked it up, and this little kid comes up with his hat in the side and his big glove, oversized glove. "Give me the ball," he says. I said, "Oh, all right. Give me the ball, I'll waltz one up your snot box." I was home.
Ladies and gentlemen, Karnig Thomasian, Chester Finagin, Charles McGee, and Bud Anderson.
Oh, boy. I'm great.
Thank you.
So tomorrow at 12:10 local, as you look up and the trainers start pushing through, you're going to see these historical formations progress. And when you look up and you see the B-24 and the red tail on the wing, I know that you're going to think of Charles and remember this night. When you look at 4 Mustangs commemorating the long-range fighter escort, you're going to think of Bud. When you see 3 Corsairs in formation representing the Battle of Iwo Jima, Chester, we're going to be thinking of you. And Karnig, when Fifi comes over, Fifi, we are going to be proud. So it's going to be one heck of a show. And David, thank you so much for being with us tonight. What an outstanding job.